She disappeared after the Alpha King chose another. Now he's tearing the kingdom apart to find her. Prologue. Scarlet had always known she was the kind of Omega people forgot. Not beautiful enough to be remembered. Not powerful enough to matter. Just a kitchen girl with flour-dusted hands and dreams too big for someone born to knead bread and stay invisible. So when King Joshua smiled at her in the palace gardens, really smiled, like she was someone worth seeing, she'd made the fatal mistake of believing it meant something, of letting herself hope that maybe, just maybe, an Alpha King could look past bloodlines and ancient laws and choose love instead of duty. She'd been wrong. The wedding announcement came on a Tuesday. King Joshua was to marry Lady Celeste of House Silvermoon, a union demanded by the law of founding blood, an ancient magic that bound the throne to the oldest families, ensuring that only heirs of pure lineage could inherit the crown. It was tradition. It was necessary. It was everything Scarlet could never be. She'd stood in the kitchen, surrounded by excited chatter about royal romance, while something inside her quietly broke. And when Joshua found her that night, when he cornered her in the garden where they'd shared so many stolen moments and tried to explain with anguish in his amber eyes that he had no choice, that the law demanded this sacrifice, that his heart belonged to her even if his future couldn't, Scarlet had done the only thing that made sense. She'd looked at the man she loved, the king who would marry another in 3 weeks, and she'd lied. "I understand, Your Majesty," she'd said, voice steady even as her world collapsed. "I hope you'll be very happy." Then she'd curtsied, perfectly proper, perfectly distant, and walked away before he could see her cry. What Scarlet didn't know, disappearing into the night with nothing but a traveling cloak and a shattered heart, was that the law of founding blood had one exception, one loophole written in magic so old that even the royal archives had forgotten it, and that the Alpha King she left behind would tear his kingdom apart, searching for the Omega who'd made him remember what it felt like to be whole. If you love intense stories about wolves, with destiny and twists and turns, subscribe to the channel now. We post videos every day, so subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any episodes. How about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, author of the stories, and you. Comment below with your name and which city you're watching from. Chapter 1. The wedding announcement arrived on a Tuesday, which Scarlet would later think was fitting because Tuesdays had always been unlucky for her. She was kneading bread in the palace kitchens, her hands working the dough in that rhythmic push and fold motion she could do without thinking, when the head cook burst through the heavy wooden doors with a scroll clutched in her flour-dusted hands and an expression that said someone important had made a very important decision that would affect all the unimportant people. "His Majesty is to be married," the cook announced, her voice carrying that particular pitch that meant gossip was about to spread through the palace faster than fire through dry grass. "To Lady Celeste of House Silvermoon. The ceremony will take place in 3 weeks' time." The dough beneath Scarlet's hands went suddenly stiff, or maybe that was her entire body forgetting how to move properly. Around her, the kitchen erupted into excited chatter, other servants squealing about romance and royal weddings, and finally, the Alpha King would have a proper queen to stand beside him. But Scarlet just stood there, staring at the sticky mess clinging to her fingers, while her heart did something that felt distinctly like shattering into approximately 7,000 pieces. 3 weeks. King Joshua had 3 weeks left before he belonged to someone else entirely. "Scarlet!" The cook's sharp voice cut through her paralysis like a knife through warm butter. "Don't just stand there like a statue in the town square, girl. That bread won't knead itself, and we'll need twice the usual amount for the pre-wedding festivities. Maybe 3 times considering how many nobles will descend on us like locusts." "Yes, ma'am," Scarlet managed, forcing her hands to move again, even though they felt numb and distant, like they belonged to someone else standing in a completely different kitchen, in a completely different life. She focused on the rhythmic push and fold of the dough, using the familiar motion to anchor herself while her mind spun in circles that went absolutely nowhere useful. This was fine. She was fine. It wasn't like she'd actually believed that the moments she'd shared with the king meant anything beyond simple kindness from a ruler to his subject. No. She refused to finish that thought, because finishing it would mean admitting she'd been harboring hope in places where hope had no business existing. Because she had believed, in the small, secret hours before dawn, when she'd been foolish enough to let herself dream. She'd believed that maybe, just maybe, the way King Joshua looked at her when he thought no one was watching meant something. That the gentle smiles he saved for their early morning conversations in the palace gardens, when he'd find her collecting herbs for the kitchen and stop to ask about her day, weren't just kindness from a ruler to his subject. That the way his fingers sometimes brushed hers when she handed him his breakfast tray was intentional rather than accidental. She'd been an idiot. A spectacular, world-class, award-winning idiot. "Isn't it romantic?" sighed Bella, one of the younger kitchen maids, leaning against the work table with the dreamy expression of someone who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. "Lady Celeste is supposed to be the most beautiful woman in 3 territories. They say her hair is like spun moonlight and her eyes are violet. Actual violet. Like spring flowers." "Violet eyes," scoffed Marcus, the assistant cook who had opinions about everything from proper bread temperature to the meaning of life. "That's physically impossible. Someone's been exaggerating again. Probably the same people who claimed the Duke's daughter could sing so beautifully that birds fell from the sky in awe." "They did fall from the sky," Bella protested, her cheeks flushing pink. "My cousin was there. She saw it happen." "Your cousin also claimed she saw a ghost in the wine cellar, and that turned out to be the head butler sneaking drinks after hours," Marcus pointed out with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed being right. "That's completely different. My cousin saw Lady Celeste at the summer festival," Bella continued, determinedly ignoring Marcus's skepticism. "She said Lady Celeste looked like she'd stepped out of a painting. All elegant and graceful, like she was born knowing exactly how to be perfect. Like being flawless was just something that came naturally to her. The way breathing comes to the rest of us. The opposite of me, then," Scarlett thought with a bitterness that tasted like ash on her tongue. Because she'd been born knowing exactly how to be clumsy, too loud, and completely unsuitable for anything beyond kitchen work and bread making. Last week she'd managed to trip over literally nothing while carrying a tray of pastries, sending 24 carefully crafted cream puffs flying across the dining hall in what Marcus had called the most spectacular culinary disaster of the season. She was an Omega from the lowest-ranked family in the territory. Her father had been a woodcutter, her mother a seamstress, both long dead from the fever that had swept through their village when Scarlett was 14. She'd survived by the sheer luck of being away visiting her grandmother when the sickness hit, staying for what was supposed to be a weekend, and returning to find her entire world gone. Afterward, with no family and no prospects and nowhere else to go, she'd made her way to the capital and begged for any work at all. The palace kitchens had taken her in, and she'd been grateful. She was still grateful even now. She had steady work, a warm place to sleep in the servants' quarters, and 3 meals a day. That was more than many Omegas could claim, especially ones without family connections or dowries or anything of value beyond the ability to bake a decent loaf of bread. The fact that she'd been stupid enough to fall in love with the Alpha King, a man so far above her station that they might as well exist in different worlds entirely, possibly different planets, was her own fault. Her own ridiculous, impossible, heartbreaking fault that no one had forced on her. "I heard the marriage is required by ancient law," Marcus was saying now, apparently having forgiven Bella for the violet eyes claim since he was sharing information with her again. Something about bloodlines and inheritance. The king has to marry someone from a founding family to legitimize his heirs. Otherwise, the magic won't recognize them as true rulers, and the whole kingdom could fall into chaos. "But that's so old-fashioned," Bella protested, her romantic nature clearly offended by the practicality of arranged royal marriages. "This is the modern age. Surely King Joshua could marry whoever he wants. Isn't love supposed to matter? Kings don't get to do what they want, girl. They do what they must, same as the rest of us, only with more people watching and judging their every choice." Marcus shook his head, looking oddly sympathetic in a way that made Scarlett's chest tighten uncomfortably. "Even if their heart is elsewhere, Even if duty demands they sacrifice what they actually want for what the kingdom needs. Scarlett's hands stilled on the dough, her fingers pressing into the soft surface hard enough to leave deep impressions, even if their heart is elsewhere. What a dangerous, foolish thought to let take root in her mind like a weed in a garden. "Scarlett, that bread looks like you've been wrestling it instead of kneading it," the cook said, suddenly appearing at her elbow with that uncanny ability she had to materialize exactly when you were doing something wrong. She frowned at the overworked dough that had gone tough and stubborn beneath Scarlett's distracted hands, the texture all wrong for what should have been light, fluffy loaves. "Start over, and pay attention this time. We can't serve the nobility bread that has the consistency of leather, no matter how distracted you are by royal wedding announcements." "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am," Scarlett said quietly, scraping the ruined dough into the waste bin with more force than strictly necessary. She reached for fresh flour, grateful for something to do with her hands that didn't involve thinking about royal weddings or broken hopes, or the way her chest felt like someone had reached inside and squeezed her heart until it forgot how to beat properly. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks that normally brought her comfort, but today felt hollow. She prepared vegetables for the evening stew, her knife moving in automatic motions. Chop, chop, chop. While conversation swirled around her about wedding preparations and Lady Celeste's rumored beauty, and whether the ceremony would be held indoors or in the palace gardens. "I hope it's in the gardens," Bella was saying to anyone who would listen, which currently was just old Thomas the dishwasher, who was too deaf to actually hear her but nodded encouragingly anyway. Can you imagine how romantic it would be? With all the spring flowers blooming and the sun setting behind them, turning everything golden? It would be like a scene from a storybook. Scarlett could imagine it, actually, in painful detail. She could picture Joshua standing there in his formal robes, looking every inch the powerful Alpha King he was, while Lady Celeste, beautiful, perfect, violet-eyed Lady Celeste, walked down an aisle lined with roses to take his hand, to stand beside him, to become his queen. The image made something twist in her stomach that felt distinctly like she might be sick all over the vegetables she was supposed to be chopping. By the time evening arrived and the dinner service began, Scarlett had achieved a state of numbness that was almost peaceful. She moved through the familiar choreography of kitchen work, carrying dishes, refilling water pitchers, clearing plates, without really being present in her own body. It was like watching someone else perform her life while she floated somewhere above, detached and distant. She was so lost in this strange, disconnected state that she didn't notice someone had entered the kitchen until his voice, warm and concerned and achingly familiar, cut through the noise. "Scarlett?" She spun around, nearly dropping the stack of plates she was carrying, and found herself face to face with King Joshua. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking completely out of place among the hanging pots and flour-dusted surfaces, still wearing his formal council attire from whatever important meetings had filled his day. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it in frustration, and his amber eyes held an expression that made Scarlett's carefully constructed numbness crack around the edges. The kitchen had gone absolutely silent, every servant freezing mid-task to stare at the unprecedented sight of the Alpha King in their domain. Kings didn't visit kitchens. They had servants to bring them whatever they needed. They didn't come down here where the common people worked. "Your Majesty," the head cook managed, dropping into a curtsy that was impressive considering her age and the fact that she was holding a large pot of soup. "We weren't expecting... Is something wrong with the meal service? If there's been a complaint..." "No, everything is fine," Joshua said quickly, but his eyes never left Scarlett's face. "I was hoping to speak with Scarlett. Privately, if possible." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop by several degrees, as every eye turned to stare at Scarlett with varying expressions of shock, curiosity, and, from Marcus, something that looked suspiciously like knowing sympathy. "Of course, Your Majesty," the cook said, though her tone suggested this was absolutely not normal and she would be demanding explanations later. "Scarlett, you may use the herb storage room. It's quiet there." Scarlett's heart was hammering so hard she was surprised everyone couldn't hear it echoing off the stone walls. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading since the announcement. The moment where Joshua would try to explain, to apologize, to somehow make sense of the fact that he was marrying someone else in 3 weeks. She didn't want his explanations. She didn't want his apologies. She wanted to maintain what little dignity she had left by pretending her heart wasn't breaking. But kings didn't make requests that you could refuse, so Scarlett set down her stack of plates with trembling hands and followed Joshua through the kitchen, past the wall of staring faces, and into the small, dim room where they stored herbs and spices. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the space felt impossibly small, the air thick with things unsaid. Chapter 2. The herb storage room smelled like rosemary and thyme, and the lavender sachets Scarlett had hung from the ceiling beams last month to keep the space fresh. It was a small room, barely large enough for 2 people to stand without touching, and Scarlett found herself pressed back against the shelves while Joshua filled the remaining space with his presence. The single lamp hanging from a hook cast shadows across his face, making his expression harder to read, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. He looked tired, she thought, with a pang she had no right to feel, like he hadn't been sleeping well, like something heavy was weighing on him in ways that went beyond normal royal responsibilities. "You've been avoiding me," Joshua said quietly, and there was hurt in his voice that made Scarlett's carefully constructed walls tremble. "I haven't been avoiding you, Your Majesty," Scarlett lied, keeping her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his left shoulder because looking directly at him felt like staring into the sun. "I've simply been busy with my duties. The wedding preparations require extra work and don't." The single word was soft, but carried enough command to make her words die in her throat. "Please don't do that. Don't pretend with me. Not you. Not you." As if she was somehow different from everyone else who had to pretend and perform around royalty. As if the months they'd spent talking in the gardens had created something real instead of just a pleasant diversion for a lonely king. "I don't know what you want me to say," Scarlett managed, still not looking at him directly. "I want you to look at me," Joshua said, and there was something raw in his voice that finally made her eyes snap to his face. "I want you to tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling, because you disappeared after the announcement, and I've been going slowly insane trying to figure out if you're angry or hurt or—" "You're getting married," Scarlett interrupted, and her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "To Lady Celeste of House Silvermoon, in 3 weeks. What exactly am I supposed to be feeling, Your Majesty?" Joshua flinched like she'd struck him. "I tried to tell you before the announcement. I came to find you that morning, but you'd already heard, and then you vanished into the kitchens and wouldn't see me. There was nothing to tell," Scarlett said, wrapping her arms around herself even though the room wasn't cold. "You're the king. You have duties, ancient laws to uphold. I understand that. Everyone understands that. Do you?" Joshua took a step closer, and Scarlett fought the urge to retreat further into the shelves. "Do you understand that the law of founding blood gives me no choice? That if I don't marry someone from one of the 5 founding families, any heirs I have won't be recognized by the kingdom's magic? That the crown itself could reject them? Could plunge us into succession crisis?" "I said I understand," Scarlett repeated, but her voice cracked on the words. "The law is absolute," Joshua continued, and now he sounded desperate, like he needed her to understand not just with her head, but with her heart. "It's woven into the magic that holds this kingdom together. It's not something I can ignore or work around or wish away no matter how much I—" He stopped abruptly, jaw clenched, and Scarlett saw him physically force himself to step back and take a breath. "No matter how much you what?" she asked, even though she knew she shouldn't, even though hearing him say it would only make everything worse. Joshua looked at her with eyes that held so much longing it hurt to witness. "No matter how much I wish I could choose differently. No matter how much I want—" "Don't," Scarlett whispered, cutting him off before he could finish that sentence. "Please don't say it, because it doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what either of us wants. You're going to marry Lady Celeste because that's what the law requires, and I'm going to stay here in the kitchens where I belong, And we're going to forget that this, she gestured helplessly between them, that this ever meant anything. It meant everything, Joshua said fiercely, closing the distance between them in one stride. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her skin with a gentleness that made her eyes burn with unshed tears. These past 6 months, getting to know you, talking with you every morning in the gardens, it's been the only real thing in my life. The only time I feel like myself instead of just the crown and the title. Then why? Scarlett's voice broke, and she hated herself for it. Why did you let me fall in love with you if you knew this was coming? The admission hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Joshua's expression crumpled, and for a moment he looked young and lost, and nothing like a powerful alpha king. Because I'm selfish. Because I fell in love with you too, and I couldn't make myself stop even though I knew. Even though I always knew. He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. They both knew how this story ended. I need to go, Scarlett said, pulling back from his touch even though every part of her wanted to lean into it. The cook will wonder where I am. Scarlett, please. Congratulations on your engagement, Your Majesty, Scarlett said, and she was proud that her voice came out steady despite the tears now sliding down her cheeks. I hope you and Lady Celeste will be very happy together. She moved toward the door, but Joshua caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm enough to stop her. I don't love her, he said quietly. I haven't even met her yet. The betrothal was arranged by our families when we were children. She's a duty, Scarlett. A necessity. But you, I'm a kitchen maid, Scarlett finished for him, gently pulling her wrist free. And you're the Alpha King. And some things can't be changed, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. She opened the door and stepped out into the kitchen before he could respond, before he could say anything else that would make this impossible situation hurt even more than it already did. The other servants were making a show of being busy with their tasks, but Scarlett could feel their eyes on her as she walked back to her station, could practically hear the gossip that would spread through the palace by morning. The king had sought out a kitchen omega. They'd been alone together. She'd emerged with tears on her face. The story would twist and grow in the telling, she knew, until it became something scandalous and shameful. But Scarlett couldn't bring herself to care about gossip when her entire world had just confirmed its own ending. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Scarlett made a decision. She couldn't stay here and watch Joshua marry someone else. Couldn't bear the thought of seeing him walk past with Lady Celeste on his arm, of serving them meals, of watching him build a life with someone who fit into his world in all the ways Scarlett never could. She would leave. Quietly. Before the wedding. Before she had to witness the moment that would make his marriage real. It would hurt. It already hurt. But staying would hurt more. Staying would slowly destroy her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person she'd been before she'd made the mistake of falling in love with a king. So she would go. And maybe, eventually, in some other city where no one knew her story, she could figure out how to be whole again. Chapter 3. Leaving the palace turned out to be significantly more complicated than Scarlett had anticipated, which she probably should have realized given that her life had never been simple. First, there was the matter of actually having somewhere to go. She couldn't just wander out into the world with no destination and hope for the best. That was how people ended up robbed, lost, or employed by questionable traveling circuses that promised adventure, but delivered mostly disaster and occasional bear attacks. Second, she needed money, which was a problem because servants were paid quarterly, and she'd just spent most of her last wages on new boots after her old ones had literally fallen apart mid-shift, the sole detaching from the upper in what Marcus had called a structural failure of epic proportions. And third, perhaps most problematically, she'd apparently developed a reputation as that Omega the king is sweet on, which meant people were watching her. Not obviously, but she could feel the weight of curious eyes tracking her movements through the palace, noting when she came and went, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. "You're being paranoid," she muttered to herself, 3 days after her conversation with Joshua, while folding linens in the storage room and trying to figure out how to acquire travel funds without anyone noticing. "Talking to yourself is the first sign of madness," said a cheerful voice from the doorway, and Scarlet nearly jumped out of her skin. She whirled around to find Lydia, one of the palace seamstresses, leaning against the doorframe with an expression of profound amusement. Lydia was in her 50s, had raised 6 children of her own, and possessed an uncanny ability to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "I'm not going mad," Scarlet said defensively, clutching a folded sheet to her chest like a shield. "I'm just thinking out loud." Lydia stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, which immediately made Scarlet nervous because people only closed doors when they wanted to have serious conversations. "And would this thinking out loud have anything to do with the fact that you've been asking around about which roads lead north, and whether the merchant caravans are hiring escorts, and what the weather's like this time of year in the mountain passes?" Scarlet's stomach dropped somewhere in the vicinity of her knees. "I was just curious." "Dear girl, I have been working in this palace for 30 years, Lydia interrupted gently, settling herself on a stack of blankets like she was preparing for a long chat. "I have seen at least a dozen young people in love with someone they couldn't have, and every single one of them went through this exact same panicky planning phase before they tried to run away." "I'm not running away," Scarlet protested, even though that was exactly what she was doing. "I'm just considering other opportunities for professional development." Lydia's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Professional development. In the merchant caravans, where the primary job requirements are, can lift heavy things, and doesn't mind sleeping on the ground." When she put it that way, it did sound somewhat unconvincing. Scarlet sank down onto a trunk, still clutching her sheet, and felt her carefully constructed plans crumble around her. "I can't stay here, Lydia. I can't watch him marry her. I can't smile and serve their meals and pretend my heart isn't breaking every single time I see them together." "No one's asking you to pretend," Lydia said softly. "But running away in the middle of the night with barely any coin and no real plan? That's not protecting your heart, sweetness. That's just trading one kind of pain for another." "At least it would be a different pain," Scarlet said, and was horrified to feel tears burning behind her eyes again. She'd cried more in the past 3 days than she had in the past 3 years combined, and she was thoroughly sick of it. Lydia was quiet for a moment, studying Scarlet with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to all the broken, hurting places. "What if I told you there was another option? One that didn't involve sleeping rough with merchant caravans or trying to outrun your feelings?" "I'd say you were about to suggest something I probably won't like," Scarlet said warily. "My sister runs an inn," Lydia said, ignoring Scarlet's skepticism with the ease of someone who was used to being right. "About 2 days' journey west in the town of Millhaven. It's a nice place, quiet, respectable, always needing reliable help. She's been after me for months to send her someone trustworthy who knows their way around a kitchen." Scarlet's heart did a strange little jump that felt suspiciously like hope trying to resurface. "You think she'd hire me?" "I know she would, especially with a recommendation from me," Lydia said firmly. "And it's far enough that you won't have to hear every detail of the royal wedding, but close enough that you're not completely cut off from everyone you know. Plus, Millhaven is on the main trade road. Lots of travelers, lots of stories, lots of life happening to keep you distracted from your own troubles." It was a better plan than Scarlet's half-formed ideas about merchant caravans and vague notions of heading north until she ran out of kingdom. Significantly better, actually, now that she thought about it with something resembling logic instead of just heartbroken panic. "Why are you helping me?" Scarlet asked quietly. "You barely know me." Lydia smiled, and there was something sad but kind in her expression. "Because 30 years ago, I was in love with someone I couldn't have. And instead of leaving with any dignity, I stayed and watched him marry someone else, and it nearly destroyed me. Took me 5 years to finally leave, and by then I'd wasted so much time being miserable that I'd almost forgotten how to be anything else." "But you're happy now," Scarlet said, because Lydia was one of the most cheerful people in the palace. "Now, yes. But I could have been happy much sooner if someone had given me permission to leave and a safe place to go." Lydia stood, smoothing her skirts. "So I'm giving you what I didn't have. A way out that doesn't involve you ending up robbed by bandits or employed by a questionable circus. How did you know about the circus concern? Scarlett asked, startled. It's always either bandits or circuses in these situations, Lydia said wisely. Now I'll write to my sister tonight. You start preparing to leave quietly. Pack light. Don't tell anyone except maybe the head cook because she'll need to know you're going. Give your notice properly so you leave on good terms. When should I go? Scarlett's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Before the wedding, Lydia said gently. Definitely before the wedding. I'd say a week from now, which gives you time to prepare and gives me time to arrange everything with my sister. A week. 7 days until she left the only home she'd known for the past 12 years. 7 days until she left behind the man she loved and tried to figure out how to build a life that didn't include him. It felt simultaneously too soon, and not soon enough. Thank you, Scarlett said and meant it with her whole bruised heart. I don't know why you're being so kind, but thank you. We Omegas have to look out for each other, Lydia said with a wink. Now stop folding sheets like you're trying to strangle them, and maybe try to eat something. You've been looking pale lately, and I won't have you fainting on the road to Millhaven and making my sister think I sent her someone unreliable. After Lydia left, Scarlett sat in the linen storage room for a long time, holding her sheet and trying to process the fact that she now had an actual plan. A real destination. A safe place to go. It should have made her feel better, but instead, she felt hollow. Because having a plan made it real. Made the leaving concrete instead of just a desperate fantasy she'd been nursing in the dark hours before dawn. She was really going to leave. Really going to walk away from the palace. From her friends, from Joshua. The thought made her chest ache, but underneath the ache was something else. Something that felt almost like relief. Because as much as it hurt to go, staying would hurt more. Staying would mean watching Joshua build a life with Lady Celeste, watching him smile at someone else, watching him become truly unreachable instead of just impossible. Better to leave with her dignity intact and her heart merely broken than to stay until she shattered completely. Scarlett took a shaky breath, set down her sheet, and went to find the head cook. Time to give her notice and start saying goodbye to the life she'd thought she'd have forever. Chapter 4. The head cook took Scarlett's resignation with surprising grace, though her expression suggested she knew exactly why one of her most reliable kitchen workers was suddenly desperate to leave 2 weeks before the royal wedding. Millhaven's a good town, the cook said, not looking up from the soup she was stirring with the kind of focused attention that meant she was deliberately not making this conversation more emotional than it needed to be. My cousin married a baker there years ago. Says it's peaceful, quiet. Good place to start over when you need a fresh beginning. The unspoken understanding hung between them like steam from the pot. I'll work until the end of the week, Scarlett offered, feeling like she should say something more, explain herself better, but not knowing what words could possibly encompass the mess of feelings tangled in her chest. You'll work until the day you leave and not a moment longer, the cook corrected firmly. I'll not have anyone saying we worked you until the last second and sent you off exhausted. You'll take your final day to rest and pack properly, understand? Scarlett's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're training your replacement first, the cook said. But there was warmth beneath the gruff words. That new girl, Anna. She's clumsy but teachable. Show her your bread recipe, the one that never fails. I'll not have the quality of our kitchen declining just because you decided to chase better prospects. They both knew better prospects was generous code for running away from heartbreak. But Scarlett appreciated the kindness of the lie. The next few days passed in a strange blur of normal routine, punctuated by the growing reality that she was leaving. She taught Anna how to knead bread without overworking it, how to tell when the oven was the right temperature, how to season the soup so it tasted like comfort instead of just salt and vegetables. She packed her few belongings, clothes, a spare pair of boots, the small carved wolf her father had made her before he died, and a book of recipes she'd been copying over the years. She said goodbye to the other servants, making up vague excuses about family opportunities and new positions that no one really believed, but everyone politely accepted. Marcus gave her a slightly squashed meat pie for the journey and advice about avoiding bandits that mostly involved run fast and scream loud. Bella cried and made her promise to write, even though they both knew Scarlett probably wouldn't. And through it all, she managed to avoid Joshua entirely. Which was easier than expected, since he'd apparently stopped coming to the kitchens and had canceled their usual morning garden meetings. Scarlett told herself she was relieved, that it made leaving easier, that not having to say goodbye to him face to face was a blessing. She told herself these things, and tried very hard to believe them. On her last evening, Scarlett stood in the palace gardens one final time, looking at the roses that had been blooming there since spring. This was where she'd first really talked to Joshua, 6 months ago, when she'd been collecting herbs, and he'd startled her by asking what she was gathering and why. She'd expected him to be distant, formal, every inch the intimidating Alpha King. Instead, he'd been curious and surprisingly funny, with a self-deprecating humor about his own lack of botanical knowledge that had made her laugh despite her nervousness. That first conversation had led to another, and then another, until it became routine for them to meet in the gardens most mornings before the palace fully woke. They'd talked about everything and nothing, her childhood in the village, his struggles with council meetings, her love of baking, his secret passion for terrible poetry that he'd tried to hide until she'd caught him composing an ode to breakfast pastries. Somewhere in those stolen morning hours, Scarlett had fallen completely, irrevocably in love. "I thought I might find you here," said a voice behind her, and Scarlett's heart stopped, then started again at twice its normal speed. She turned slowly to find Joshua standing on the garden path, still in his formal council clothes, but with his jacket missing and his sleeves rolled up like he'd been pacing somewhere and gotten too warm. His dark hair was disheveled, his amber eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and he looked at her with an expression that made her want to simultaneously run toward him and run away. "Your Majesty," Scarlett said, dropping into a curtsy that felt wrong after months of easy familiarity. I heard you're leaving," Joshua interrupted, taking several steps closer. "Tomorrow morning, for Millhaven." Of course he'd heard. Kings knew everything that happened in their palaces. "Yes, Your Majesty. I've been offered a position at an inn there. Better opportunities." "Better opportunities," Joshua repeated. And there was something raw in his voice. "Is that really why you're going, Scarlett? Or are you running away from me?" The blunt question hung between them like a challenge. "I'm not running from you," Scarlett said, even though they both knew it was at least partially a lie. "I'm running from this. From a situation that hurts every day and will only get worse after you marry Lady Celeste." Joshua flinched at the name. "I don't want you to go. And I don't want to watch you marry someone else," Scarlett shot back, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "But we don't always get what we want, do we? You taught me that. That's not fair. None of this is fair." Scarlett's voice rose despite her best efforts to keep it level. "It's not fair that I fell in love with you. It's not fair that you let me. It's not fair that ancient laws and bloodlines matter more than what we actually feel. But that's reality, and I'm finally accepting it. So please don't make this harder by asking me to stay and watch you belong to someone else." Joshua looked stricken, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What if I told you I've been researching the law of founding blood? Looking for loopholes, exceptions, anything that might—" "Don't," Scarlett said, cutting him off before he could finish that dangerous thought. "Don't give me hope when there isn't any. You've told me yourself the law is absolute, that you have no choice." "There's always a choice," Joshua said desperately. "Maybe not an easy one, maybe not one without consequences, but there's always—" "And what would happen if you refused to marry Lady Celeste?" Scarlett challenged. "What would happen to your kingdom? To your people? Would the magic accept your heirs? Would other territories respect your rule? Or would everything your family has built start to crumble?" Joshua's jaw worked, and she saw him struggle with the answer they both knew. "That's what I thought," Scarlett said more softly. "You're a good king, Joshua. You put your people first, even when it costs you personally. That's one of the things I love about you. So don't ask me to be the reason you stop being that person. Don't ask me to watch you sacrifice everything you've worked for. I never wanted this, Joshua said, and his voice broke on the words. I never wanted duty to feel like a cage. I know, Scarlett whispered, moving closer despite every instinct that said keeping distance was safer. I know you didn't. But it's still a cage, and I can't be locked in there with you, slowly suffocating while you try to be both the king you have to be and the man you want to be for me. It wouldn't work. It would destroy us both. She reached up and touched his face, letting herself have this one moment of intimacy before she left forever. His skin was warm beneath her palm, and she felt him lean into her touch like a man starving for affection. I need you to let me go, Scarlett said, even though saying it felt like tearing out her own heart. I need you to marry Lady Celeste and be the king your people need. And I need to go build a life in Millhaven where I can heal and maybe, eventually, be happy again. And if I can't let you go? Joshua asked, covering her hand with his own. If I've been tearing myself apart for days trying to figure out how to fix this, how to keep you, how to not lose the only person who makes me feel like myself instead of just a crown and a title, then you let me go anyway, Scarlett said, and tears were sliding down her cheeks now despite her best efforts to remain composed. Because you love me enough to want me to be happy, even if it's not with you. They stood there in the garden as the sun set behind them, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Scarlett memorized every detail of this moment. The way the fading light caught in Joshua's dark hair, the exact shade of amber in his eyes, the feeling of his hand covering hers, the ache in her chest that she knew would take years to fade, if it ever faded at all. I will always love you, Joshua said finally, his voice rough with emotion. No matter who I marry, no matter how much time passes, you will always be the one my heart chose, and I will always love you, Scarlett echoed, rising on her toes to press one soft kiss to his cheek. The first and last time she would let herself touch him like this. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes duty and reality and impossible laws matter more. She stepped back, letting her hand fall away from his face, and turned toward the palace before she could change her mind. Before she could throw herself into his arms and beg him to find a way, any way, to make this work. Goodbye, Joshua, she said without looking back. Be happy, or at least try to be. Then she walked away from the garden, from the king she loved, from the life she'd imagined, and tried to convince herself that she was doing the right thing, even if it felt like the most wrong thing she'd ever done. Chapter 5. The journey to Millhaven took 2.5 days instead of 2, mostly because the cart driver Lydia had arranged for Scarlett's transport had an unfortunate tendency to stop at every single tavern along the road to check on old friends, which apparently meant drinking ale and telling increasingly implausible stories about a bear he claimed to have wrestled in his youth. It was this big, Gerald the cart driver was saying to his current audience, spreading his arms wider than seemed anatomically possible, while Scarlett waited outside with the cart and tried not to think about what she was leaving behind. Teeth like daggers, claws like really big claws, you know what I mean. Scarlett did not know what he meant, but she also didn't particularly care because her mind was stuck somewhere back in the palace gardens, replaying her goodbye to Joshua on an endless, torturous loop. She'd left before dawn the next morning, as planned, slipping out of the servants' entrance with her small pack of belongings, and her heart feeling like it had been replaced with something heavy and cold. She hadn't looked back, couldn't look back, because looking back would have made her second-guess everything, would have made her weak enough to stay. The first day of travel had been bearable because she'd been too numb to feel much of anything. The second day had been worse because the numbness had started wearing off, replaced by a grief so profound it felt like drowning in slow motion. And now, on this interminable third day, she was cycling through emotions like a deranged weather pattern. Sadness, then anger, then regret, then determination, then back to sadness again. You look like someone died, Gerald observed cheerfully when he finally emerged from the tavern, smelling strongly of ale and questionable life choices. Did someone die? Please tell me no one died. I can't handle crying passengers. Last time I had a crying passenger, she sobbed so hard she scared my horse, and we ended up in a ditch. No one died, Scarlett assured him, climbing back into the cart with as much dignity as she could muster. I'm just tired. Tired. Right. Gerald clucked at his horse, a patient creature named Buttercup who seemed resigned to her owner's eccentricities, and they resumed their journey down the winding road. You know what you look like? You look like someone who's running away from a broken heart. I've transported 17 broken-hearted people in my time as a cart driver, and they all had that exact same expression. Like someone had reached into their chest and rearranged all their important bits incorrectly. That was actually an uncomfortably accurate description. I'm not running away, Scarlett said, even though at this point that denial was wearing thin even to her own ears. I'm pursuing new opportunities. Sure, new opportunities. That's what they all say. Gerald was quiet for a moment, then added with surprising gentleness, For what it's worth, miss, running away isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do, knowing when to leave instead of staying somewhere that's slowly destroying you. Scarlett felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Did you run away from something? Oh, yes. Terrible job working for a noble who thought reasonable working hours meant 20 hours a day, and fair wages meant whatever coins he found in his pocket after buying expensive wine. Gerald grinned. Best decision I ever made leaving that place. Led me to cart driving, which led me to my wife, which led me to relative happiness interrupted only occasionally by bear-related flashbacks. Did you actually wrestle a bear? Scarlett asked, partly curious and partly desperate to think about anything other than the ache in her chest. Not even a little bit. But people enjoy the story. And who am I to deprive them of entertainment? He winked at her. Sometimes a good lie is more useful than a boring truth. They arrived in Millhaven just as the sun was setting, painting the small town in shades of amber and gold that reminded Scarlett painfully of Joshua's eyes. She firmly pushed that thought away and focused instead on her surroundings. Millhaven was charming, actually. Smaller than the capital, but larger than her childhood village, with neat rows of buildings lining cobblestone streets and window boxes full of flowers that suggested people here cared about appearances. The inn stood at the town's center, a 3-story building with warm light spilling from its windows, and a painted sign declaring it, the Silver Heart Inn, fine food and finer company. Lydia's sister, Meredith, turned out to be a woman in her 60s with the same sharp eyes as her sibling, and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately made Scarlett feel both intimidated and safe. So, you're the girl running from a broken heart, Meredith said by way of greeting, looking Scarlett up and down with an assessing gaze. Good. Broken-hearted girls work harder than happy ones. Come on, I'll show you your room, and then you can start in the kitchen tomorrow morning. Can you bake? Yes, ma'am, Scarlett managed, still processing being called broken-hearted within 30 seconds of arrival. Can you clean without breaking things? Usually. Can you handle drunk customers without crying or stabbing anyone? I think so? Good enough. Rooms on the 3rd floor, meals included, wages paid weekly. Meredith started up the stairs at a pace that suggested she had places to be and no patience for dawdling. Lydia says you're reliable and good with your hands, which is all I need to know. The rest we'll figure out as we go. The room was small but clean, with a bed that looked significantly more comfortable than her cot in the palace servants' quarters, a window overlooking the town square, and a small table with a lamp. It was simple, practical, completely impersonal. It felt nothing like home, which was probably for the best. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar town, Scarlett let herself cry properly for the first time since leaving. She buried her face in the pillow so no one would hear, and let out all the grief she'd been holding back. Great, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. She cried for the future she'd imagined and lost, for the man she loved and had to leave, for the version of herself who'd been foolish enough to believe that maybe, somehow, love would be enough. When she finally exhausted herself into sleep, she dreamed of amber eyes and garden roses and a voice saying, "I will always love you," in a tone that made the words sound like both a promise and a goodbye. She woke the next morning with swollen eyes, a headache that felt like her brain was staging a revolt, and a determination to move forward even if moving forward felt impossible. The work at the Silver Heart Inn was demanding in ways that were different from the palace kitchens. Meredith ran a tight operation that catered to merchants, travelers, and locals who appreciated good food served without pretension. Scarlett spent her days baking bread, preparing meals, serving customers, and cleaning rooms, a rotating schedule that kept her busy enough that she couldn't spiral into misery every waking moment. The other staff were friendly in a cautious way, clearly curious about the new girl who'd arrived with sad eyes and a tendency to stare off into space when she thought no one was watching. There was Thomas, the cook, who had opinions about proper seasoning that he shared loudly and frequently. Mary, the head server, who could carry 6 plates at once and had mastered the art of deflecting inappropriate comments from drunk customers with surgical precision. And young Peter, the stable hand, who was 16 and convinced he was desperately in love with every woman who smiled at him, which meant he fell in and out of love approximately 8 times per day. "You're from the capital?" Mary asked one evening after the dinner rush, when they were wiping down tables, and Scarlett's feet hurt enough that she was considering whether amputation might be less painful. "Yes," Scarlett said, not offering more details. "Did you work at the palace? Someone said you worked at the palace." Word traveled fast, apparently. "In the kitchens. I was a baker." "Oh," Mary's eyes lit up with interest. "So you'll have heard all about the royal wedding then. It's supposed to be in, what, a week now? Everyone's been talking about it. They say Lady Celeste is the most beautiful woman in 3 territories, and that the king is madly in love with her." Something sharp twisted in Scarlett's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wouldn't know about that. I left before the wedding preparations really got started." That was technically true, even if it left out the part about leaving specifically to avoid the wedding. "Still, it must be exciting. A royal wedding." Mary sighed dreamily. "I bet it'll be absolutely magical. All the nobles dressed in their finest, flowers everywhere, vows of eternal love." "Mary, could you check on table 7? Meredith's voice cut through the conversation with perfect timing, and Scarlett shot her employer a grateful look. Meredith just nodded slightly and moved on, but Scarlett got the distinct impression that Lydia had shared more details about her situation than she'd realized. The days began to blur together into a routine that was almost soothing in its predictability. Wake early, bake bread, serve breakfast, clean rooms, prepare lunch, serve lunch, clean more, prepare dinner, serve dinner, clean everything, collapse into bed exhausted. The work was hard enough that Scarlett fell asleep quickly most nights, too tired for the kind of painful introspection that had characterized her first few days in Millhaven. But she still thought about Joshua. Every morning when she kneaded bread, she remembered teaching him to recognize different herbs in the garden. Every evening when she served meals to couples dining together, she wondered what he was doing, whether he thought about her, whether he'd married Lady Celeste yet, whether he was happy. 10 days after her arrival in Millhaven, Scarlett was kneading dough in the inn's kitchen when Peter burst through the door with the kind of energy that meant either exciting news or a catastrophe. "The royal wedding's been postponed," he announced breathlessly, like this was information everyone desperately needed immediately. "I heard it from the merchant who just arrived from the capital. Says the whole palace is in an uproar. The king postponed it." Scarlett's hands stilled in the dough, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Why?" she asked, trying to sound casual and definitely not succeeding. "No one knows. The official word is unforeseen circumstances requiring the king's immediate attention, but everyone's got theories. Some people think Lady Celeste backed out. Others think the king discovered some kind of ancient prophecy. One person swears it's because the king's secretly in love with a commoner and is trying to find a way out of his arranged marriage." The kitchen went very quiet. Peter, bless his oblivious 16-year-old heart, didn't notice the tension. Can you imagine? A king in love with a commoner? That would be so romantic, like something out of a storybook. Though I guess it probably won't actually happen because of laws and tradition and all that boring stuff adults care about. "Peter, don't you have stables to muck?" Thomas said pointedly. Right, yes, stables. Mucking. On it. Peter dashed back out with the same energy he'd arrived with. Scarlett stared down at her hands, still buried in dough, and tried to process what she'd just heard. Postponed. The wedding was postponed. Which meant, what, exactly? That Joshua had found some loophole in the law of founding blood? That he'd decided duty could wait? That he was looking for her? Or did it mean nothing at all? Just palace intrigue and royal complications that had nothing to do with her. Don't. Meredith's voice came from behind her, gentle but firm. Don't start hoping again. Hope is dangerous for broken hearts. I'm not hoping, Scarlett lied, even as her traitorous heart was doing exactly that. Chapter 6. The problem with hope, Scarlett discovered over the following days, was that once it started, it was nearly impossible to stop. She told herself the postponed wedding meant nothing, that it was probably just some administrative issue or pre-wedding negotiation between noble families that required more time. She told herself that even if Joshua had postponed it intentionally, that didn't mean he'd done it for her. He was a king. He had 1,000 concerns more important than one runaway kitchen omega. She told herself these things repeatedly, firmly, with the conviction of someone trying very hard to believe their own lies. It didn't help that the gossip continued to flow through the inn like water through a broken dam. Every merchant who stopped in Millhaven on their way to or from the capital had new theories, new rumors, new supposedly reliable information that contradicted whatever the previous merchant had said. I heard the king refused to proceed with the wedding, a cloth merchant announced importantly over dinner 3 days after Peter's initial announcement. Just flat out refused. Told his entire council that the law of founding blood was barbaric, and he wouldn't be bound by it. That's not what I heard, countered a spice trader at the next table. I heard he discovered Lady Celeste was secretly in love with someone else, and he released her from the betrothal out of kindness. You're both wrong, said an elderly woman traveling with her daughter, speaking with the confidence of someone who considered herself an expert on royal matters. The truth is that the king has been searching for someone. A woman who disappeared from the palace right before the wedding was supposed to happen. He's apparently turning the kingdom upside down trying to find her. Scarlett, who had been refilling water pitchers and definitely not eavesdropping, nearly dropped the pitcher she was holding. Why would a king search for some random woman? The spice trader asked skeptically. He's got a whole kingdom to run. Because, the elderly woman said with the dramatic flair of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention, according to my source, who is very well connected, I'll have you know, this woman isn't random. She's the one he actually loves. The one his heart chose before duty tried to force him into a marriage he didn't want. That's the most ridiculous romantic nonsense I've ever heard, the cloth merchant scoffed. Kings don't abandon their responsibilities for love. That's not how the world works. Maybe not your world, the elderly woman sniffed. But apparently this king is different. Scarlett fled to the kitchen before anyone could notice she'd gone pale and was shaking badly enough that the water pitcher was sloshing dangerously. He was looking for her. Joshua was looking for her. Or someone was looking for someone, and these merchants were spinning it into a romantic tale that had nothing to do with reality. Gossip was notoriously unreliable, getting distorted as it passed from person to person like a game of whispered messages that started with, "The king likes cheese," and ended with, "The king is secretly a dragon." You're spiraling, Meredith observed, appearing at Scarlett's elbow with the uncanny timing she seemed to have perfected. I can see it happening. You're standing there having an entire crisis behind your eyes. I'm not, Scarlett started, then gave up because lying to Meredith was apparently impossible. What if it's true? What if he really is looking for me? Then he'll find you eventually, Meredith said practically. Millhaven isn't exactly hidden. We're on the main trade road. We have an inn that every merchant knows about, and you've been serving customers in plain sight for nearly 2 weeks. If a king wants to find someone, he finds them. That should have been reassuring, but instead it just made Scarlett more anxious. What do I even say if he shows up? Hello, Your Majesty. Sorry I ran away. Lovely weather we're having. I'd probably skip the weather commentary, Meredith said dryly. But you could start with honesty. Tell him why you left. Tell him what you need. Listen to what he has to say. And if he wants me to come back? Do you want to go back? Scarlet opened her mouth to say no, absolutely not. She'd made her choice, and she was sticking to it. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. The truth was that she'd left to protect both of them from an impossible situation. But if that situation had somehow become possible, I don't know, she admitted quietly. I don't know what I want anymore. Then figure it out before he arrives, Meredith advised. Because one thing I've learned in 63 years of life is that you can't make good decisions about your future when you haven't sorted out your own heart first. That night, Scarlet lay in bed and tried to do exactly that. Sort out her heart, figure out what she actually wanted versus what she thought she should want. The problem was that her heart had never been particularly good at logic or practicality. Her heart wanted Joshua, had wanted him from the moment she'd first made him laugh in the palace gardens. But her head knew that wanting something wasn't the same as that something being good for you. She'd left because staying would have destroyed her, watching him marry someone else. But if he'd postponed the wedding, if he was really searching for her, then maybe... Scarlet firmly told herself to stop thinking in maybes and possibilities and instead focus on sleep. She had bread to bake in the morning, customers to serve, a life to build that didn't revolve around an alpha king who probably wasn't actually tearing his kingdom apart looking for her no matter what gossiping merchants claimed. She almost believed it. The storm arrived 2 days later, sweeping into Millhaven with the kind of dramatic timing that would have been comedic if it weren't so thoroughly inconvenient. Rain lashed the windows of the Silver Heart Inn. The wind howled like it had personal grievances against the concept of calm weather, and the handful of travelers who'd been caught on the road fled inside seeking shelter, which was how Scarlet found herself serving hot soup and bread to a dining room full of drenched, cranky people who all had opinions about the weather ranging from bit of rain, never hurt anyone, to this is clearly divine punishment for humanity's sins. She was refilling ale mugs and trying not to slip on the water tracking across the floor when the door burst open again, admitting another rain-soaked traveler. This one was wrapped in a heavy cloak with the hood pulled low, and was accompanied by 2 equally drenched companions who looked like they'd been traveling hard and weren't happy about it. "Welcome to the Silver Heart," Scarlet called out automatically, not really looking at them properly because she was focused on not spilling ale on herself. "Find a seat anywhere, and I'll be right with you." She turned toward the bar to grab more mugs and completely missed the moment when the lead traveler pushed back his hood. Completely missed the way every conversation in the inn died suddenly and simultaneously. Completely missed the shocked expressions spreading across the faces of everyone who had a clear view of the door. What she didn't miss was Thomas dropping an entire tray of bowls in the kitchen, the crash echoing through the sudden silence. Scarlet spun around, confused by the abrupt quiet, and found herself staring directly at King Joshua, who stood in the doorway of the inn dripping rainwater onto the floor and looking at her like she was the only person in the entire room. His amber eyes were intense and exhausted, and full of something that looked like desperate relief. His dark hair was plastered to his head from the rain, his travel clothes were muddy and disheveled, and he looked nothing like the composed, powerful Alpha King she'd left behind in the palace gardens. He looked human, vulnerable, like a man who'd been searching for something precious and had finally found it. "Scarlet," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer and a question and a confession all at once. The ale mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, but Scarlet barely noticed because her entire world had just narrowed to the man standing in the doorway. The man who had apparently actually, impossibly torn his kingdom apart, searching for her. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "You're here." "I'm here," Joshua agreed, taking a step forward, then another, until he stood directly in front of her with no regard whatsoever for the broken glass scattered between them or the room full of witnesses watching this reunion with rapt attention. "I'm here because I found it, the loophole, the exception to the law of founding blood that no one's invoked in over 300 years. Scarlet's heart was beating so hard she thought it might actually escape her chest. "What?" "The soul bond clause," Joshua said, and now he was reaching for her hands, holding them like they were something infinitely precious. It says that if a king finds his true soul-bonded mate, the one the magic itself recognizes, that bond supersedes the founding family requirement. The magic will accept heirs born from a true soul bond, regardless of bloodline. The words were washing over Scarlet, but not quite making sense, probably because her brain had stopped functioning properly the moment Joshua had appeared. "I don't understand." "It means," Joshua said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "that if you're my true mate, and Scarlet, my soul has known you were mine since the first morning we talked in the gardens, then I can marry you. Not Lady Celeste, not some noble chosen for bloodlines and ancient laws. You." The dining room had gone so silent you could have heard a pin drop. Every single person was watching this unfold like it was the best entertainment they'd seen in years, which it probably was. "You postponed your wedding," Scarlet said slowly, trying to piece together the sequence of events. "Searched through ancient laws, traveled here in a storm. All to tell me about a loophole?" "Not just to tell you about it," Joshua corrected. "To ask you, to beg you, if necessary, to come home. To give us a chance. To let me prove that love can be enough when you find the right exception buried in 300-year-old legal texts." His hands tightened on hers, and Scarlet saw the fear in his eyes. The vulnerability of someone who'd crossed half the kingdom searching for her and was terrified she might still say no. "Say something," Joshua pleaded. "Please say something, even if it's telling me I'm insane and you've built a life here that doesn't include me." Scarlet looked at him, really looked at him, at the exhaustion etched into his face, at the hope burning in his amber eyes, at the king who'd apparently decided that ancient loopholes and soul bonds mattered more than convenience or tradition, and she started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, but the kind that bubbles up when relief and joy and sheer disbelief collide in your chest and have nowhere else to go. "You're insane," she said, but she was smiling through her tears. "You're absolutely, completely insane." "Is that a yes?" Joshua asked hopefully. "You traveled through a storm to invoke a 300-year-old loophole," Scarlet said, still half laughing and half crying. "You postponed a royal wedding. You're standing in an inn in the middle of nowhere, dripping rainwater everywhere and proposing in front of at least 20 witnesses. Technically, I haven't proposed yet," Joshua pointed out. "I was leading up to it, but if you'd prefer I skip straight there." Scarlet kissed him. Right there in the middle of the dining room, in front of Meredith and Thomas and Mary and Peter and approximately 17 merchants, she rose on her toes and kissed the Alpha King who'd torn his kingdom apart looking for her. And when they broke apart, both breathless and grinning, the entire inn erupted into applause. "I'm taking that as a yes," Joshua said, resting his forehead against hers. "That's a yes," Scarlet confirmed. "Now can someone please explain to me what a soul bond actually means? Because I feel like that's information I should have before agreeing to marry a king." "I'll explain everything," Joshua promised. "But first, do you happen to have any dry clothes? Because I'm fairly certain I'm creating a puddle." He was, in fact, creating quite an impressive puddle. "I'll find you something," Scarlet said, then looked around at their very interested audience and felt her cheeks flush. "Also, everyone's staring at us." "Let them stare," Joshua said, pulling her close despite being soaking wet. "I just found my future queen in a random inn during a storm. They can stare all they want." And wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by gossip that would spread across 3 territories by week's end, Scarlet realized that sometimes the most impossible stories really did come true. You just had to be brave enough, or foolish enough, to believe in them. Chapter 7. Explaining the soul bond turned out to be significantly more complicated than Joshua had made it sound, which Scarlet discovered approximately 20 minutes later when they were seated in Meredith's private parlor, with tea that had gone cold, because everyone was too focused on ancient magical laws to remember to actually drink it. "So let me see if I understand this correctly," Scarlet said slowly, trying to wrap her mind around concepts that felt like they belonged in fairy tales rather than her actual life. "There's a magical bond that connects soulmates. And if a king finds his soul-bonded mate, the kingdom's magic recognizes that bond as more important than bloodline requirements? Essentially, yes, Joshua confirmed, looking far more comfortable now that he'd changed into dry clothes borrowed from Thomas, which fit him poorly enough that he looked slightly ridiculous, but Scarlett found it endearing. The law of founding blood was created 3 centuries ago to ensure magical stability in the royal line. But the original lawmakers included an exception for soul bonds because they believed true soul connections carried their own inherent magic, stronger than any bloodline. But how do you know we have a soul bond? Scarlett asked, even though something deep inside her already knew the answer. Is there a test? A ceremony? Some kind of magical ritual involving questionable ingredients and dramatic incantations? One of Joshua's companions, a stern-looking woman with silver streaks in her dark hair who'd introduced herself as High Counselor Thera, spoke up for the first time. The bond manifests in several ways: mutual recognition upon first meeting, an inexplicable pull toward each other, dreams that feature your bonded mate before you've even met them, and most tellingly, the ability to sense each other's emotions across distance. Scarlett felt her cheeks heat because she'd experienced literally all of those things. She'd dreamed about amber eyes weeks before she'd actually met Joshua properly, had felt inexplicably drawn to the gardens every morning at exactly the time he happened to be there, had known, with certainty she couldn't explain, when he was troubled or happy or tired, even when they were in different parts of the palace. She'd thought she was just hopelessly in love and possibly slightly unhinged. Apparently it had been magic the entire time. The bond also, Joshua added quietly, reaching across the small table to take her hand, makes it nearly impossible to function properly when you're separated from your bonded mate, which I discovered over the past 2 weeks when I felt like someone had carved out part of my chest, and I couldn't sleep or eat or think about anything except finding you. You couldn't eat? Scarlett asked with concern. The palace cook tried everything. Nothing tasted right. Nothing felt right. His thumb traced circles on her palm in a gesture that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. My mother finally told me that if I didn't stop pacing holes in the throne room carpet and actually do something productive with my misery, she was going to have me locked in a tower until I regained my senses. Despite everything, Scarlett laughed. Your mother sounds terrifying. She is, Joshua agreed with a small smile. She's also the one who suggested I search the old legal archives for any possible exceptions to the founding blood law. She said, and I quote, "If you're going to be this dramatically miserable, you might as well be dramatically miserable while doing something useful." I like her already, Scarlett decided. She's going to like you too. Fair warning, though. She's been planning an elaborate wedding since the moment I told her I'd found the loophole, and she has opinions about flower arrangements that border on tyrannical. Joshua paused, his expression turning more serious. But Scarlett, before we go any further, I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. Being queen isn't just a title. It's constant scrutiny, endless responsibilities. Every decision you make will be analyzed and criticized. Your life will never be entirely your own again. Scarlett had been expecting this conversation, but hearing it stated so plainly still made her stomach twist with anxiety. I'm a kitchen omega from a woodcutter's family. I don't know the first thing about being royalty. I'll probably embarrass you at formal dinners and accidentally insult visiting nobles and use the wrong fork for every single course. There are multiple forks per course? Joshua looked genuinely confused. I thought there were just forks for stabbing food. Your Majesty, Thera said with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. We've discussed this. The salad fork is smaller. They're all forks, Joshua insisted stubbornly. They all stab things. The obsession with which specific fork stabs which specific food is absurd, and I've been saying this for years. Scarlett felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. If even the Alpha King thought formal dining etiquette was ridiculous, maybe she wouldn't be completely out of place. The point, Joshua continued, turning his attention back to Scarlett, is that we'll figure it out together. You don't have to know everything immediately. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself. The woman I fell in love with in the gardens. The one who laughed at my terrible jokes and corrected my plant identification and made me feel like a person instead of just a title. Your jokes really are terrible, Scarlett agreed, feeling tears prick her eyes again. You once spent 15 minutes explaining a pun about bread that wasn't even funny. It was hilarious, Joshua defended. You just didn't appreciate the nuanced wordplay. It was a pun about loafing around, Scarlett said flatly. That's not nuanced. That's the most basic bread pun in existence. You smiled, though, Joshua pointed out triumphantly. I saw you try not to smile. I was smiling at how proud you were of your terrible pun, not at the pun itself, Scarlett clarified. But she was grinning now, feeling more like herself than she had since leaving the palace. Thera cleared her throat pointedly. Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss the practical details. The legal requirements for invoking the soul bond clause, the timeline for returning to the capital. Right. Yes. Practical details. Joshua visibly pulled himself together, though his hand remained clasped around Scarlett's. The soul bond clause requires 3 things. First, a formal declaration of the bond before the High Council. Essentially, we both testify that we recognize each other as soul-bonded mates. Second, a magical verification performed by the kingdom's most senior mage, who can sense the bond's authenticity. And third, a binding ceremony that officially recognizes the bond in the eyes of both law and magic. So basically, we have to convince your council, prove it to a mage, and then get married, Scarlett summarized. In that order? Yes. Though the binding ceremony is different from a traditional wedding, it's specifically designed to seal soul bonds. We can have a regular wedding celebration afterward if you want one, but the binding ceremony is what matters legally, Joshua explained. And what if the mage says we're not actually soul bonded? Scarlett asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of her mind. What if this is just regular love, and I'm not actually your magical soulmate? Joshua's expression softened, and he raised their clasped hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll figure out another solution. Because I'm not marrying Lady Celeste regardless of what any ancient law says, even if it means abdicating and letting my younger brother take the throne. Your Majesty! Thera looked genuinely scandalized. You cannot simply abdicate. Watch me, Joshua said calmly. I've spent my entire life doing what duty demanded, following rules, sacrificing personal happiness for the good of the kingdom. But I'm not sacrificing Scarlett. I'm not sacrificing us. So either the soul bond is real and the law allows me to marry her, or I'll find another way, even if that means giving up the crown. The room fell silent, everyone processing the fact that the Alpha King had just casually threatened to abdicate over a kitchen Omega. Scarlett's heart was doing something complicated that felt like it might actually burst out of her chest. You'd really give up being king? For me? In a heartbeat, Joshua said simply. Being king means nothing if I can't share my life with you. That's the most ridiculous, impractical, completely insane thing I've ever heard, Scarlett said, and then she was kissing him again because words weren't adequate for the overwhelming emotion flooding through her. I'm going to give you two some privacy, Thera announced dryly, standing up. Your Majesty, we'll prepare for departure in the morning. The weather should clear by dawn. Miss Scarlett, I suggest you use this evening to make any necessary arrangements with your employer and pack whatever belongings you wish to bring to the capital. She swept out of the room with the other companion, a quiet man named Marcus who served as Joshua's personal guard, leaving Scarlett and Joshua alone. I can't believe this is really happening, Scarlett whispered when they finally broke apart. 2 weeks ago, I was running away to avoid watching you marry someone else. Now you're telling me we're soul-bonded mates and I'm going to be queen. Having second thoughts? Joshua asked, though his tone was light. His eyes betrayed a flicker of real worry. Constant thoughts, Scarlett admitted honestly. Terrified thoughts. Overwhelming thoughts about all the ways I could mess this up. But also, she cupped his face in her hands. Thoughts about how you crossed half the kingdom in a storm looking for me. How you threaten to abdicate rather than let ancient laws keep us apart. How you're looking at me right now like I'm something precious instead of something broken. You're not broken, Joshua said fiercely. You're exactly what I needed, what the kingdom needs. Someone real. Someone who will challenge me when I'm being stubborn and laugh at my terrible jokes and remind me that being king doesn't mean losing my humanity. Your jokes really are terrible, though, Scarlett felt obligated to point out. I know. It's part of my charm. Joshua grinned. Then his expression turned more serious. Scarlett, I need you to know. If the magical verification doesn't work, if the soul bond isn't recognized for some reason, I meant what I said. I'll find another way. I'll change laws, abdicate if necessary, move to a different kingdom if that's what it takes. Because I choose you. In every possible future, I choose you. Scarlett felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were happy tears, relieved tears. The tears of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. I choose you too, she said softly. I chose you the first morning you stopped to ask me about herbs in the garden, and then listened like my answer actually mattered. I've been choosing you every day since, even when I thought I had to walk away. They sat there in Meredith's parlor as the storm gradually cleared outside, holding each other and making plans and occasionally getting distracted by kissing. Eventually, Meredith knocked on the door with dinner, looking thoroughly entertained by the entire situation. I expect an invitation to the royal wedding, she informed them both. After all the emotional turmoil you've put me through these past 2 weeks, it's the least you can do. Done, Joshua agreed immediately. Front row seats. Best food. Unlimited wine. I like him, Meredith told Scarlett approvingly. He's got better sense than most nobles I've met. That night, lying in her small room while Joshua was settled in the inn's best guest quarters, Scarlett stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. Tomorrow she'd return to the capital. In a few days, she'd face the High Council and a magical verification that would determine her entire future. Soon after, she'd either become queen or something else entirely, depending on how things unfolded. It should have been terrifying. And it was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. Because for the first time since the wedding announcement had shattered her world, Scarlett felt hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind she'd been trying to suppress, but the solid kind built on soul bonds and stubborn kings who refused to let ancient laws dictate their happiness. She fell asleep smiling and dreamed of amber eyes and garden roses and a future that might actually include both. Chapter 8. The journey back to the capital took 3 days, and Scarlett discovered that traveling with a king, even one trying to keep a relatively low profile, was vastly different from traveling with a chatty cart driver who told lies about bear wrestling. First, there was the security. Marcus wasn't just a personal guard. He was the captain of an elite unit that had apparently been discreetly trailing them the entire journey, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. Scarlett had counted at least 12 additional guards by the second day, all dressed as regular travelers, but moving with military precision that would have been obvious to anyone actually paying attention. Second, there was the accommodation. They didn't stay at questionable roadside taverns where the beds were lumpy and the soup was suspicious. They stayed at the finest inns in each town, where innkeepers practically fell over themselves offering their best rooms and most elaborate meals the moment they realized royalty was present. And third, most surprisingly, there was the public reaction. News of the king's search for his soul-bonded mate had apparently spread faster than wildfire through dry grass, which meant that by the time they reached each new town, crowds had gathered hoping to catch a glimpse of the kitchen Omega who'd captured the Alpha King's heart. "This is deeply weird," Scarlett muttered on the second evening, peeking through the curtains of their inn-room at the crowd still gathered outside, even though it was well past dark. Why are they all just standing there? Don't they have homes, lives, better things to do than stare at a window? They're romantic, Joshua said from where he was reviewing documents at the small desk, looking thoroughly unbothered by the attention. Everyone loves a good love story, especially one involving ancient magic and soul bonds, and a king who postponed his arranged marriage. Everyone loves it until they remember I'm a complete nobody who has no business becoming queen, Scarlett pointed out. Then I'm guessing the romance will wear off pretty quickly. Joshua set down his papers and crossed to where she stood by the window. You're not a nobody. You're my soul-bonded mate. You're the woman who makes me laugh and calls out my nonsense and isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being ridiculous. That's exactly who should be queen. I don't know anything about running a kingdom, Scarlett said, voicing the fear that had been growing louder with each mile closer to the capital. I can bake bread and clean rooms and identify medicinal herbs. None of those skills translate to formal diplomacy or managing a royal household or whatever else queens are supposed to do. My mother didn't know anything about running a kingdom either when she married my father, Joshua pointed out. She was from a minor noble house with no experience in matters of state. Know what she did? She learned, asked questions, found advisors she trusted, built her knowledge gradually instead of expecting herself to be perfect immediately. Your mother sounds remarkably sensible for someone who allegedly has tyrannical opinions about flower arrangements, Scarlett said. She's a woman of contrasts, Joshua agreed with a smile. You'll understand when you meet her. Fair warning, she will absolutely cry. She's been emotionally invested in my love life for years, and finding out I've discovered my soul-bonded mate will send her into paroxysms of joy. Paroxysms, Scarlett repeated. You really do talk like a king sometimes. Only when I'm nervous, Joshua admitted. When I'm comfortable, I use normal words like really happy instead of paroxysms of joy. What are you nervous about? He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, the magical verification. What if I'm wrong? What if what I feel for you, what we feel for each other, isn't actually a soul bond? What if it's just really intense regular love, and the mage can't detect any magical connection? Scarlett turned to face him fully, seeing the vulnerability in his amber eyes. Then we figure it out. Together. Like you said, you'll find another way. Change laws. Abdicate. Move to another kingdom. Though I'd prefer we skip the abdication part because your younger brother sounds like he'd be a terrible king. He's 17, and his primary interests are sword fighting and writing melodramatic poetry about dragons, Joshua said. He'd be an absolute disaster. Then let's hope the soul bond is real, Scarlett said, trying for lightness even though her own anxiety about the verification was keeping her awake at night. They reached the capital on the afternoon of the third day, and Scarlett's first glimpse of the city she'd fled 2 weeks ago made her chest tight with complicated emotions. The palace rose above the surrounding buildings like a mountain made of white stone and impossible dreams, flags flying from its towers and guards stationed at every entrance. Somewhere in there, she'd kneaded bread and served meals and fallen in love with a king. Somewhere in there, her old life was waiting. The servants who'd been her friends, the kitchens she'd worked in, the gardens where everything had begun. We're going to enter through the private entrance, Joshua explained as their carriage turned down a side street. It'll give us some time before the formal presentations begin. My mother is waiting, and she's promised to help you prepare for the council meeting tomorrow. Tomorrow? Scarlett's voice came out higher than intended. The verification is tomorrow? The council insisted on immediate scheduling, Joshua said apologetically. Apparently I've caused enough chaos postponing one wedding, and they'd like this matter resolved quickly before I do something else dramatically impulsive. Like threatening to abdicate? Thera may have mentioned that incident in her report, Joshua admitted. Several counselors are apparently having collective heart attacks at the mere suggestion. The private entrance led to a section of the palace Scarlett had never seen during her time working there. Elegant corridors with plush carpeting and paintings that probably cost more than her entire village's annual income. Servants in formal livery bowed as they passed, their expressions carefully neutral, even though Scarlett could feel their curiosity burning. They emerged into a private sitting room where a woman was waiting, and Scarlett knew immediately this was Joshua's mother. She had the same dark hair, the same strong features, and the same amber eyes, though hers were currently shining with tears. "My boy," Queen Mother Alara said, rising gracefully and crossing to embrace Joshua with the kind of fierce hug that transcended royal dignity. "You found her. You actually found her. I told you I would," Joshua said, returning the embrace. Alara pulled back, wiped her eyes with zero self-consciousness about crying in front of strangers, and turned her attention to Scarlet. "And you must be Scarlet, the woman my son has been pining over so dramatically that half the palace staff was ready to form a search party just to restore his appetite." "Your Majesty," Scarlet managed, dropping into a curtsy that was probably imperfect but hopefully adequate. "Oh, none of that," Alara said, pulling Scarlet up, and then, to Scarlet's complete shock, hugging her too. "We're going to be family. You'll call me Alara or Mother if you're comfortable with that, but absolutely no Your Majesty nonsense when we're in private." Scarlet found herself returning the hug, feeling some of her tension ease. "Thank you for being so welcoming. I know this whole situation is unusual." "Unusual?" Alara laughed, a bright sound that filled the room. "Darling, my son postponed a wedding, invoked a 300-year-old legal clause, and crossed the kingdom during a storm searching for his soul-bonded mate. Unusual doesn't begin to cover it. This is the most excitement we've had in decades, and I'm delighted. Mother has been planning a wedding since the moment I told her about the soul bond clause," Joshua said. "I wasn't exaggerating about the flower arrangement opinions. The flowers matter," Alara insisted. "But we'll discuss that later. Right now, we need to prepare Scarlet for tomorrow's council meeting and magical verification. Scarlet, darling, have you eaten? You look pale. Joshua, did you feed her properly on the journey? Or were you too busy being dramatically romantic?" "We ate at every stop," Joshua defended. "In-food doesn't count. I'll have proper meals sent up," Alara declared, already moving toward the door to issue instructions to waiting servants. Over the next several hours, Scarlet received what could only be described as intensive queen training. Alara walked her through what to expect at the council meeting, who the key members were, what questions they might ask, how to present herself with confidence without appearing arrogant. She explained the magical verification process, which involved the kingdom's high mage examining the magical signatures of both Scarlet and Joshua to detect the unique resonance of a soul bond. "It won't hurt," Alara assured her when she noticed Scarlet's nervous expression. "Elda is actually quite gentle. She'll ask you both to stand together. She'll perform some kind of mystical gesture thing. Honestly, I've never quite understood the technical details. And then she'll announce whether the bond is present or not." "And if it's not?" Scarlet asked quietly. Alara's expression turned serious. "Then we have a much more complicated situation. But darling, I've seen how my son looks at you. I've felt the change in him since he started searching for you. Soul bond or not, what you two have is real. We'll find a way to make it work." That night, Scarlet lay in an elaborate guest room that made her quarters at the inn look like a storage closet and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow she'd stand before the High Council and a magical verification that would either confirm she was Joshua's soul-bonded mate or reveal that they were just two people who'd fallen in love the regular way. She must have finally fallen asleep because she woke to early morning light, and a servant knocking gently on her door with breakfast and a message that the council meeting would begin in 2 hours. Time to find out if impossible fairy tales could actually come true. Chapter 9. The High Council chamber was significantly more intimidating than Scarlet had imagined, which was saying something because she'd imagined it being quite intimidating. The room was circular, with a domed ceiling painted with constellations and what appeared to be historical scenes of previous kings doing important king things. 12 council members sat in elevated chairs arranged in a semicircle, all wearing formal robes and expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to outright hostile. And at the center of the room, standing on a raised platform that made her feel like she was on display in a market, was Scarlet. Joshua stood beside her, his hand wrapped firmly around hers in a gesture that was probably breaking about 17 protocols, but which he showed no inclination to stop. On his other side stood High Mage Elda, an ancient woman who looked like she might be composed entirely of wrinkles and wisdom, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. which, given her job today, was probably accurate. "Let the record show," intoned Counselor Thera from her seat, "that we are gathered to witness the verification of a claimed soul bond between His Majesty King Joshua and Miss Scarlet of Millhaven, formerly of the Palace Kitchens. High Mage Elda will perform the verification. Your Majesty, you may present your testimony." Joshua stepped forward slightly, though he still held Scarlet's hand. "Honorable council members, I stand before you to testify that I have found my soul-bonded mate. From our first meeting, I felt a connection I couldn't explain, a recognition that went beyond physical attraction or common interests. Over the months we spent together, that connection grew stronger. I dreamed of her before we formally met. I could sense her emotions across distance, and when she left the palace 2 weeks ago, I felt as though part of my soul had been torn away." His voice was steady, formal, every inch the king addressing his council, but his thumb was tracing nervous circles on Scarlet's palm, betraying the anxiety he was hiding beneath royal composure. "And you, Miss Scarlet?" Thera turned her attention to Scarlet, eyes sharp and assessing. "Do you claim the same bond?" Scarlet swallowed hard, acutely aware that 12 pairs of eyes were focused on her. "Yes, Counselor. I felt the connection from the beginning, though I didn't understand what it was. I thought I was just—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "Hopelessly in love in a way that made no practical sense. But it was more than that. I knew things about His Majesty's emotional state that I shouldn't have been able to know. I dreamed about Amber Eyes for weeks before we spoke, and when I left, it felt like I'd left part of myself behind." "Convenient testimony," said one of the council members, an older man with a sour expression that suggested he disapproved of everything on principle. "Young people in love often feel dramatic connections. That doesn't mean it's a soul bond. Which is precisely why we have the magical verification, Counselor Aldrich," Thera said smoothly. "High Mage Elda, please proceed." Elda stepped forward, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones were older than most of the furniture in the room. "Your Majesty, Miss Scarlet, please face each other and join both hands." Scarlet turned to face Joshua, taking his other hand so they stood connected, and tried to ignore the fact that her palms were sweating enough to be embarrassing. Joshua squeezed her hands gently, and through their connection, soul bond or just regular love, she still wasn't entirely sure. She felt his reassurance washing over her like a warm wave. "Now," Elda said, raising her hands in what did indeed look like mystical gestures. "Remain still and open. The magic will do the rest." What happened next was difficult to describe. Scarlet felt a tingling sensation start at her fingertips where she touched Joshua, then spread up her arms and through her chest. It wasn't unpleasant, more like the feeling of static electricity, but warmer, more alive. She watched as a faint golden light began to emanate from where their hands joined, growing brighter with each passing second. The light spread around them like a living thing, wrapping them in a cocoon of shimmering gold that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. And then, impossibly, wonderfully, Scarlet could feel Joshua's emotions as clearly as her own. His love, fierce and unwavering. His hope that this would work. His absolute certainty that she was his, soul bond or not. And she knew somehow that he was feeling the same things from her. The light flared brilliantly, bright enough that several council members gasped, and then gradually faded back to nothing. Scarlet blinked spots from her vision and found Elda watching them with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Well," the High Mage said, and there was definite amusement in her ancient voice. "That was about as clear as soul bond verifications get. I haven't seen a magical response that strong in 60 years of performing these ceremonies." The council chamber erupted into murmurs, some excited, some skeptical, some that sounded like people frantically revising their opinions. "The bond is authentic?" Thera asked, though her tone suggested she'd already seen the answer. "Extraordinarily so," Elda confirmed. "The magical signature is unmistakable. These two are soul-bonded mates, recognized by the kingdom's magic itself. Therefore, per the ancient clause in the law of founding blood, King Joshua is legally permitted to take Miss Scarlet as his queen, and any heirs born of their union will be accepted by the kingdom's magic regardless of bloodline." Counselor Aldrich looked like he'd bitten into something sour. This is highly irregular. The girl has no training, no proper background. The girl, Scarlet interrupted before she could stop herself, is standing right here and can hear you talking about her like she's a piece of furniture being evaluated for purchase. Dead silence fell over the chamber. Scarlet immediately regretted her outburst, but Joshua was grinning. Actually grinning. And Elda was making a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "My apologies, Miss Scarlet," Aldrich said stiffly, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "However, my concern stands. You lack the training necessary for—" "Then I'll learn," Scarlet said, finding her courage again since she'd already committed to speaking up. Queen Mother Alara didn't have extensive training when she married the previous king, and by all accounts, she's been an excellent queen. I'm not claiming I'll be perfect immediately. I'm claiming I'll work hard, learn quickly, and do my best to serve this kingdom alongside His Majesty. And if that's not adequate for some of you, well—" She glanced at Joshua, who nodded encouragingly. "The soul bond has already been verified. The law is on our side." "Indeed it is," Thera said, and there was definite approval in her voice now. "Counselor Aldrich, your concerns are noted for the record. However, the magical verification has confirmed the soul bond, which supersedes questions of background or training. Miss Scarlet will have ample support and instruction as she assumes her role. Now, shall we proceed to the formal vote acknowledging the bond and approving the binding ceremony?" The vote passed with 9 in favor and 3 abstentions, which Alara later explained was actually better than expected given how much nobles hated change. After the meeting, Scarlet found herself swept into a whirlwind of activity that made her head spin. There were formal announcements to prepare, a binding ceremony to plan, protocols to learn, and approximately 17 different people who needed to measure her for various ceremonial outfits. She met Joshua's younger brother, Prince Adrian, who was indeed 17 and obsessed with dragon poetry, though he seemed sweet in an awkward, overly enthusiastic way. "This is so romantic," Adrian declared when introduced to Scarlet, looking like he might actually swoon. "A soul bond, true love conquering ancient laws. It's like something out of a ballad. I'm already composing verses. Would you like to hear them?" "Maybe later," Joshua said quickly, steering Scarlet away before Adrian could launch into what was probably terrible poetry. "Much later, like possibly never." "I think he's sweet," Scarlet said. "He wrote a 50-stanza epic about a dragon who fell in love with a cloud," Joshua said flatly. It did not end well for anyone involved, including the audience. Over the next 3 days, Scarlet learned more about being royal than she'd absorbed in 12 years working in the palace. Alara was a patient teacher, explaining everything from formal dining etiquette. The forks are ridiculous, just use whichever one feels right, to how to navigate court intrigue. Smile politely and reveal nothing unless you're certain of someone's loyalty. She also reconnected with her friends from the kitchen staff, who were alternately thrilled and shocked by her transformation from Kitchen Omega to future queen. "I always knew you were special," Bella declared, hugging Scarlet so hard her ribs creaked. "Well, not new, but I had a feeling. Remember when I said you had a regal quality about you?" "You never said that," Marcus pointed out. "I was thinking it very loudly," Bella insisted. The binding ceremony was scheduled for the following week, giving the palace time to prepare and giving Scarlet time to have what felt like several small panic attacks per day about the fact that she was about to become queen. "What if I mess up?" she asked Joshua one evening as they walked through the gardens where everything had started. "What if I accidentally insult a visiting dignitary or use the wrong fork at a crucial dinner or forget someone's title? Then we'll handle it together," Joshua said, pulling her close. "Scarlet, you stood before the High Council and called out Counselor Aldrich for being rude. You've already proven you can handle difficult situations with grace and honesty. The rest is just details we'll figure out as we go." "Easy for you to say. You've been training to be king since you were 5, Scarlet pointed out. "And I still use the wrong fork regularly," Joshua admitted. "Last week I ate salad with a dessert spoon because they all looked the same to me. 3 counselors had heart palpitations, but the salad still got eaten. Despite her anxiety, Scarlet laughed. "You're not helping." "I'm helping by reminding you that perfection isn't required," Joshua said, turning her to face him. "Just presence. Just showing up as yourself. That's all I need, and that's all the kingdom needs." The night before the binding ceremony, Scarlet stood at her window looking out at the capital spread below the palace, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she'd officially become Joshua's bonded mate, recognized by both law and magic. Tomorrow, she'd step into a role she'd never imagined for herself. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was exactly what she wanted, and everything she'd feared in equal measure. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Alara standing there with a velvet box. "I thought you might like to see this," the Queen Mother said, entering and opening the box to reveal a delicate crown, smaller and simpler than the formal state crown, made of silver vines intertwined with tiny gemstones that caught the light. "It was mine when I first became queen. I wore it at my binding ceremony, and now I'd like you to wear it at yours." Scarlet felt tears prick her eyes. "I can't. That's too precious." "Which is exactly why you should wear it," Alara said firmly. "You're joining our family, Scarlet. You're becoming my daughter in all the ways that matter. And I want you to know that you belong here, crown and all." They stood there in the lamplight, and Scarlet let herself be hugged by the woman who would become her mother, and felt, for the first time since this impossible journey began, like maybe, just maybe, she really could do this. Tomorrow, she'd find out. Chapter 10. The binding ceremony took place at dawn, which Alara had explained was traditional for soul bond unions, something about the magic being strongest at the threshold between night and day. Scarlet stood in a preparation chamber, wearing a dress that was somehow both simpler and more elegant than anything she'd ever imagined wearing. It was made of pale cream silk that flowed like water, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that resembled growing vines. The crown Ilara had given her sat on her carefully arranged hair, feeling simultaneously too heavy and weightless. "You look like a queen," Bella declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that was already thoroughly soaked. "A beautiful, perfect queen who used to be my friend and now is going to be far too important to remember us kitchen folk." "I'm never going to be too important to remember you," Scarlet said firmly. "You're my friends. That doesn't change just because I'm wearing fancy clothes and a crown that's making my neck hurt." "The crown always hurts at first," Alara said, making final adjustments to Scarlet's dress. "You get used to it, or you develop very strong neck muscles. Either way, it gets easier." Mary and several other servants from the kitchen had been invited to witness the ceremony, filling Scarlet with gratitude for Alara's thoughtfulness. They would stand in a section reserved for the bride's chosen family, a tradition that apparently recognized that family wasn't just about blood. "It's time," Alara said gently, squeezing Scarlet's hands. "Are you ready?" "No," Scarlet admitted honestly, "but I'm going anyway." The ceremony took place in the palace's ancient chapel, a space that predated the current palace and was built directly over a convergence of magical ley lines. The walls were carved with symbols representing the kingdom's history, and the floor was inlaid with precious stones that formed patterns meant to channel magic. Joshua was already waiting at the front, wearing formal robes in deep blue that made his amber eyes seem to glow. When Scarlet entered and their eyes met across the chapel, she saw his breath catch, saw his face transform with something that looked like awe. Through their soul bond, now recognized and official, she felt his emotions crash over her. Love, so fierce and profound it made her knees weak. Pride that she was his. Gratitude that she'd chosen him. And underneath it all, a bone-deep certainty that this was exactly where they both belonged. The walk down the aisle felt both endless and instantaneous. Scarlet was vaguely aware of people watching, nobility, council members, servants, guards. But her focus had narrowed to the man waiting for her at the front. When she reached him, Joshua took her hands, and the world felt like it clicked into place. High Mage Elda presided over the ceremony, her ancient voice carrying through the chapel with surprising strength. We gather at dawn to witness the binding of soul-bonded mates, a union recognized not just by law, but by the magic that flows through our kingdom itself. King Joshua and Lady Scarlet, you stand before us having proven your bond through magical verification. Do you now choose, freely and without coercion, to bind your souls in permanent union? I do, Joshua said, his voice steady and sure. I do, Scarlet echoed, meaning it with her whole heart. Elda raised her hands, and the magical symbols carved into the floor began to glow with soft golden light. Then, by the power vested in me by tradition and magic, I bind your souls together. What magic has recognized, let no law separate. What love has joined, let no duty divide. The golden light rose from the floor, swirling around Scarlet and Joshua like a living thing. It felt warm and right, like coming home after a long journey. Scarlet felt the bond between them strengthen, solidify, become something unbreakable. When the light faded, Elda was smiling. It is done. I present to you King Joshua and Queen Scarlet, soul-bonded mates and rightful rulers of this kingdom. The chapel erupted into applause. Joshua pulled Scarlet close and kissed her. And through their bond, she felt his joy mixing with hers until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Hello, my queen, he whispered against her lips. Hello, my king, she whispered back. The celebration that followed was elaborate and overwhelming and wonderful. There was a feast that lasted hours, with food Scarlet had helped plan, ensuring there were dishes from her village alongside the elaborate noble cuisine. There were toasts and well wishes, and unfortunately, a dramatic poetry reading from Prince Adrian about soul bonds and destiny that made several people weep, though whether from emotion or from the terrible rhyme scheme was unclear. Late in the evening, when the formal celebrations had finally wound down, Scarlet and Joshua escaped to the palace gardens. They walked the familiar paths where everything had started, and Scarlet marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. Do you regret it? Joshua asked quietly. Leaving your simple life for all of this? Scarlet thought about the question seriously. She thought about the responsibilities that now rested on her shoulders, the scrutiny she'd face, the expectations she'd have to navigate. She thought about the fact that her life would never be entirely her own again. Then she looked at the man beside her, her soul-bonded mate, her king, her home. Not for a single moment, she said honestly. Being with you is worth every challenge. Being your queen is worth every sacrifice. Good, Joshua said, pulling her close. Because I plan to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never regret choosing me. They stood there in the garden as night deepened around them, holding each other beneath the stars, and Scarlet knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The kitchen Omega who'd fallen in love with a king. The runaway who'd been found. The woman who'd discovered that sometimes impossible fairy tales really do come true, as long as you're brave enough, or foolish enough, to believe in them. Epilogue. 5 years later, Scarlet stood in the same garden where everything had begun, watching her 3-year-old daughter chase butterflies with the determined focus of someone on a very important mission. Mama, I almost caught one, Princess Arya declared, her amber eyes, so like her father's, bright with excitement. Keep trying, sweetness, Scarlet encouraged, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child was making their presence known through enthusiastic kicks. Joshua appeared at her side, sliding an arm around her waist. Council meeting ran late. How are you feeling? Like I'm carrying a tiny acrobat who's training for competitive tumbling, Scarlet said. But good. Happy. Good. Joshua pressed a kiss to her temple. Because I've been informed we have a state dinner tonight with the visiting dignitary from the Southern Territories. And I need my brilliant queen beside me to handle all the complicated diplomatic discussions while I smile and nod. You're better at diplomacy than you pretend, Scarlet said. Maybe, but you're better at knowing when people are lying, which is significantly more useful. Joshua grinned. 5 years had taught Scarlet many things about being queen. She'd learned the formal protocols. She'd navigated court intrigue and established her own network of advisors. She'd proven herself capable and strong and worthy of the crown she wore. But more importantly, she'd learned that being queen wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up as herself, bringing her unique perspective and background to a role that had become entirely her own. "Mama, Papa, look!" Arya's excited shriek drew their attention. Their daughter stood perfectly still, arms outstretched, with a butterfly perched delicately on her finger. Her face was transformed with wonder and joy, and through the soul bond she shared with Joshua, Scarlet felt his heart swell with the same fierce love she felt. This was her life now. Not perfect, but hers. Full of diplomatic dinners and royal responsibilities and tiny acrobats practicing in her womb, and daughters who caught butterflies and a soul-bonded mate who still made terrible bread puns. And she wouldn't change a single moment of it. The end. If this story of soul bonds, second chances, and finding where you belong touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Which moment made you smile? The storm reunion, the council confrontation, or Arya catching her butterfly? Subscribe for daily stories of supernatural romance where love finds a way, even when ancient laws try to keep it apart. With love and magic, Maggie Reed.